They were 72 and 74 years old, abandoned by their own children, living in the frozen edge of Alaska where temperatures hit -40, and when they finally entered the decommissioned research station to escape a deadly blizzard, what they found sealed beneath the ice would expose a secret worth $280 million and prove their family wrong about everything. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind off the Beaufort Sea didn't just blow through the small cabin. It screamed. It rattled the double-paned windows that Margaret and Thomas had installed themselves 15 years ago, back when their hands were steadier and their children still called on Sundays. Now the cabin sat alone on the edge of nothing, 300 miles north of Fairbanks, surrounded by white silence and the kind of cold that turned breath into ice crystals before it left your lungs. Margaret Parker stood at the kitchen window, her 72-year-old hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't drink it. She just held it, watching the snow accumulate against the north side of the greenhouse Thomas had built for her 30th anniversary, 42 years ago, back when the world felt less empty. Outside, Thomas was checking the generator again. She could see his silhouette through the early November darkness, bent over the rumbling machine, flashlight tucked under his chin, the way he'd done 1,000 times before. He was 74 now, but he moved with the same deliberate precision he'd had when they first met at the Anchorage Research Symposium in 1973. She'd been presenting findings on Arctic soil composition. He'd been the quiet equipment specialist in the back row who asked the one question no one else thought to ask. That was 51 years ago. Margaret set the mug down and turned away from the window. The cabin was small but warm, heated by a wood stove Thomas fed every 4 hours like clockwork. The walls were lined with bookshelves, photographs, and memories of a life built in the margins of civilization. She walked past the old rotary phone mounted on the wall, the one that hadn't rung in 3 weeks, and sat down at the wooden table where they took every meal together. On the table sat a single envelope, postmarked 2 weeks ago from Seattle. Her daughter's handwriting. She'd already read it 17 times, but she picked it up again anyway. The paper was soft from handling, creased along the same lines. Mom and Dad, I don't know how else to say this. Richard and I have talked, and we think it's time you seriously consider moving closer to us. You're both in your 70s now. Living that far north, that isolated, it's not safe anymore. What happens if one of you falls? What happens when the generator breaks and Thomas can't fix it? We love you, but we can't keep worrying like this. There are excellent assisted living facilities near us. We've looked into them. You'd have people around, medical care, activities. It's time to let go of the cabin and come home. Please think about it. We won't keep asking forever. Love, Sarah. Margaret folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Her throat felt tight. Assisted living, activities, come home. As if this place wasn't home. As if 50 years of research, love, and stubborn survival meant nothing because they'd grown old while doing it. The door opened with a gust of wind and snow. Thomas stepped inside, shaking ice from his coat. His beard was white now, thick and untrimmed, his face weathered like old leather. But his eyes, pale blue and sharp, still carried the same quiet strength that had made her fall in love with him half a century ago. Generator's holding, he said, pulling off his gloves. But the fuel line's getting brittle. I'll need to replace it before spring. Margaret nodded. Coffee's cold. I'll make more. Don't bother. He sat down across from her, his joints creaking softly. He saw the envelope. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Sarah again? He asked. Richard too, apparently. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough, scarred from decades of fieldwork and repair jobs. You want to go? No, Margaret said immediately. Then softer. Do you? He shook his head. I'd rather die here than live somewhere they call activities meaningful. She smiled despite the ache in her chest. That was Thomas. Blunt, honest, immovable. They think we're being stubborn, she said. We are, he replied, but we're also right. They sat in silence for a while, holding hands across the table while the wind howled outside. The stove crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a tree branch snapped under the weight of ice. They stopped calling, Margaret said quietly. Thomas squeezed her hand. I know. Sarah used to call every Sunday. Now it's been 3 weeks. They're angry. They think we're choosing this place over them. Thomas looked at her, his gaze steady. We're not choosing the place. We're choosing ourselves. There's a difference. Margaret's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years, not when their son Daniel stopped returning emails, not when Sarah's birthday cards stopped coming, not even when their youngest, Michael, told them flat out that he was tired of pretending they'd ever move. She'd cried herself dry a long time ago. I miss them, she whispered. So do I, Thomas said, but I won't apologize for living the life we built. He stood slowly, his back protesting, and walked to the shelf near the door. He pulled down a worn notebook, the kind they used to carry in the field, and brought it back to the table. You remember Frost Point? He asked. Margaret blinked. The old research station? Yeah, of course I remember. You worked there before we got married. Thomas nodded, flipping through the pages. 1976 through 79. Best equipment job I ever had. They had funding, real scientists, cutting-edge geology work. Until they shut it down, Margaret added. Yeah, Thomas said, his voice distant. Until they shut it down. He stopped on a page covered in his younger handwriting, sketches of the facility layout, notes about generators and water filtration systems. I've been thinking about it lately. It's only a mile from here, been abandoned since '83, but it was built to last. Triple insulation, geothermal backup systems, storage facilities designed for long-term deep freeze. Margaret frowned. Why are you thinking about it? Thomas looked up at her. Because if this storm gets worse, and I mean really worse, we might need somewhere with better shelter. Our generator's old, the fuel won't last forever. But Frost Point, if the systems are still intact, it could be a backup. Thomas, that place has been empty for 41 years. Doesn't mean it's dead, he said. Cold preserves things. You know that better than anyone. She did know. She'd spent her career studying permafrost, analyzing soil samples that held organic matter frozen for thousands of years. The Arctic didn't decay things the way the rest of the world did. It suspended them, waiting. You kept a key, didn't you? She asked. Thomas smiled faintly. Maintenance master key. Never turned it in when I left. Why not? He shrugged. Felt wrong, like I was supposed to hold on to it. Margaret studied his face. After 51 years, she could read him like the soil cores she used to analyze. There was something he wasn't saying. What is it? She asked. Thomas closed the notebook. Nothing, just a feeling. Thomas? He met her eyes. When they shut down Frost Point, it wasn't gradual. It was fast. 1 week we were running full operations. The next week we got orders to evacuate. They didn't even let us pack properly. Just told us to leave everything and go. You never told me that. Didn't seem important at the time, but I've been thinking about it more lately. Why shut down a fully functional research station in the middle of a project? Why leave millions of dollars in equipment behind? Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Curiosity. The same thing that had driven her into research in the first place. You think there's something there, she said. I think there might be answers, Thomas replied. And I think if the weather keeps getting worse, we might need shelter. 2 birds, 1 stone. She looked toward the window. The snow was falling harder now, thick and relentless. the kind of snow that buried things. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. Storm's supposed to peak tonight, but there'll be a window around dawn. We go then, check the facility, see what's still operational. We'll be back before lunch." Margaret thought about the letter from Sarah, about assisted living facilities and activities and people who thought they knew better. She thought about her children who'd stopped calling because she and Thomas refused to become convenient. And she thought about the life she'd lived. Decades of field research, of discovery, of pushing into places no one else wanted to go. She'd spent her whole career digging into the frozen earth looking for truth. Maybe there was one more truth waiting. "Okay," she said. "We'll go." Thomas nodded, but didn't smile. He rarely smiled anymore. "Get some rest. I'll wake you at 5. That night, Margaret lay in bed listening to the wind tear across the tundra. Thomas was already asleep beside her, his breathing deep and steady. She stared at the ceiling, watching shadows dance in the dim glow of the wood stove through the bedroom door. She thought about Sarah, about Daniel, about Michael, her babies, grown now with children of their own. Children Margaret and Thomas had only met through video calls and mailed photographs. Sarah had been 8 years old when they moved to Alaska permanently. She'd cried for 3 months, begging to go back to Anchorage where her friends were. But eventually she'd adjusted. She'd learned to love the silence, the stars, the endless white. Or so Margaret had thought. Daniel had been 6, quieter than Sarah, more like his father. He'd taken to the wilderness like he was born for it, spent hours outside exploring, collecting rocks, asking questions about everything. Margaret thought he'd become a scientist like them. Instead, he'd become an accountant in Denver, married a woman who thought Alaska was too depressing. They had 2 kids Margaret had never held, and Michael, her youngest, born in Alaska, raised in the cold. He'd left at 18 and never looked back. Now he was in California, working in tech, living a life so far removed from hers she could barely picture it. They'd all left. And maybe that was natural. Maybe that was what children were supposed to do. But the way they'd left, the anger, the resentment, the endless pressure for Margaret and Thomas to abandon everything and follow them into lives that didn't fit. That part hurt. Margaret rolled onto her side and looked at Thomas. Even in sleep, his face carried a kind of determination. He'd never wavered, never doubted their choice to stay. She loved him for that. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing she knew, Thomas was gently shaking her shoulder. "It's time," he said softly. Outside, the sky was still dark, but the wind had died down to a low moan. Margaret dressed in layers: thermal underwear, wool pants, fleece, insulated coveralls, 2 pairs of socks. Thomas helped her with her boots, the heavy Arctic kind with felt liners and rubber shells. They moved through their routine with practiced efficiency. Thomas loaded a backpack with emergency supplies: flares, a first aid kit, dried food, water bottles wrapped in insulation, extra batteries, rope. Margaret grabbed her old field notebook and a camera. Habit: always document. By 5:30, they were standing outside the cabin. The temperature was -38 degrees. The sky was beginning to show the faintest hint of grey on the eastern horizon. Thomas checked his GPS unit, though he didn't really need it. He'd walked to Frost Point hundreds of times. But the Arctic was unforgiving to assumptions. 1 mile northeast, he said. We'll follow the old service road. Stay close. Margaret nodded, pulling her face mask up over her nose. They started walking. The snow was knee-deep in places, crusted hard in others. Their headlamps cut weak tunnels through the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret's breath formed clouds that froze instantly on her face mask. Her fingers were already numb despite the gloves. This was the Arctic. This was home. They walked in silence, their boots crunching in rhythm. Thomas led, breaking trail. Margaret followed in his footsteps, conserving energy the way they'd learned decades ago. After 20 minutes, Thomas stopped and pointed. Ahead, barely visible against the white landscape, a dark shape rose from the snow, massive, angular, half-buried. Frost Point Research Station. Margaret felt her heart rate increase. She hadn't seen the facility in over 40 years, hadn't thought about it much except as part of Thomas's past. Now, standing before it, she felt something else. Anticipation, unease. They approached slowly. The main structure was a sprawling complex of connected buildings, all concrete and steel, built to withstand the worst the Arctic could throw at it. Most of it was buried under decades of snowdrift, but the central tower still jutted up like a tombstone. Thomas led them around to the east side, where a smaller entrance was partially sheltered by an overhang. He brushed snow away from the door, revealing a metal surface covered in frost. From his pocket, he pulled out a key. It was old, brass, worn smooth by time. 45 years, he said. Let's see if it still works. He inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. The mechanism was frozen solid. Then Thomas pulled out a small lighter and heated the key. Carefully, patiently, the way he did everything. After 2 minutes, he tried again. The lock turned with a grinding sound that echoed across the empty tundra. The door opened. Cold air rushed out, even colder than the outside. The smell hit Margaret immediately. Metal, concrete, and something else. Preservation, like opening a time capsule. Thomas clicked on his flashlight and stepped inside. Margaret followed. They were in a narrow corridor, everything covered in a thin layer of frost. Emergency lighting strips ran along the ceiling, all dark. Their footsteps echoed. Thomas led them forward, past offices with desks still covered in papers, past a break room with coffee mugs frozen mid-rinse in the sink. Everything exactly as it had been left in 1983. "This is incredible," Margaret whispered. "It's perfectly preserved." "Told you," Thomas said. "Cold does that." They moved deeper into the facility. Thomas navigated from memory, taking them through a maze of corridors, past dormitories with beds still made, past a library with books on shelves, past a mess hall with trays stacked neatly beside industrial sinks. "How many people worked here?" Margaret asked. At peak, maybe 35, scientists, support staff, security. Security? For a research station? Thomas didn't answer immediately. They'd reached a stairwell. He shined his light down. The stairs descended into darkness. "There were always things about this place that didn't add up," he said finally. "The security was too tight for basic climate research. Armed guards, restricted areas I couldn't access even with a master key, shipping containers arriving in the middle of the night. What were they researching? Officially, permafrost geology, climate patterns, soil composition." He paused. "But there were whole sections of the facility I never saw, and the people who worked in those sections, they didn't talk to the rest of us." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Thomas started down the stairs. She followed, counting steps. 20, 30, 40. They were going deep. At the bottom, another corridor. This one looked different. The walls were rougher, less finished. They passed through a heavy blast door that had been left open. "I was only down here once," Thomas said, "the day before they evacuated. I had to do an emergency repair on a water line, but they escorted me the whole time. Wouldn't let me look around." "What do you think they were hiding?" "I don't know, but I remember thinking it was strange for a climate research station to have sublevels this deep. We're at least 60 feet underground now." They continued walking. Margaret's scientific mind was racing. Subsurface facilities in permafrost were incredibly expensive to build and maintain. The geothermal dynamics alone would require sophisticated engineering. This wasn't just a research station. This was something else. Thomas stopped abruptly. Ahead, the corridor opened into a larger space. He swept his flashlight across it. Margaret gasped. They were standing at the entrance to a massive chamber, but it wasn't constructed from concrete like the rest of the facility. The walls were stone, carved stone, ancient-looking, fitted together with precision. "What the hell?" Thomas muttered. They stepped inside. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 40 feet across. The ceiling arched overhead, disappearing into shadow, and along the walls, evenly spaced, were metal containers. Big ones, industrial-grade storage units. Margaret walked to the nearest one. It was sealed, locked, covered in frost. There was a label, but it was in some kind of code, just numbers and letters that didn't mean anything obvious. "Thomas," she said, "what is this place?" He was staring at something on the far wall, a control panel, or what used to be a control panel. The screens were dark, the buttons frozen. "I don't know," he said, "but it wasn't here in '79, or if it was, they kept it hidden from everyone." Margaret moved to another container. Same thing. Locked, labeled in code, perfectly preserved by the cold. Then she saw something else. A desk tucked into an alcove, and on the desk, a leather journal. She picked it up carefully. The cover was stiff with cold but intact. She opened it to the first page. Project Midnight Sun, classified level 5, director's log. Her hands trembled, not from cold. "Thomas," she said, "you need to see this." He came over, reading over her shoulder. Margaret flipped through the pages. They were filled with handwriting, technical notes, coordinates, chemical formulas, and photographs. Dozens of them, tucked between pages. Photographs of core samples, mineral deposits, geological formations she'd never seen before, and estimates, value estimates. Margaret stopped on one page. Her breath caught. Total estimated value of extracted samples, $280 million. They stared at the number in silence. $280 million, Margaret whispered. Thomas took the journal from her hands, flipping forward. "Look at the dates. This was active from 76 through 83, the whole time I was working here." "What were they mining?" Thomas read aloud. "Rare earth elements, platinum group metals, concentrations found in permafrost core samples at depths exceeding 200 meters, samples extracted and stored pending processing and distribution." He looked up at the metal containers lining the walls. "It's here, all of it. They never moved it." Margaret's mind was reeling. This was illegal. It had to be. You can't just mine the Arctic without permits, without environmental review, without— "They didn't care," Thomas interrupted. "Look at this." He showed her another page, a list of names, government officials, corporate executives, senators. They were all in on it, he said. And when someone tried to expose it, they shut the whole thing down and buried it, literally. Margaret walked to one of the containers and placed her hand on the cold metal. Inside this box was a fortune, and there were 27 containers in this room alone. "Why didn't they come back for it?" she asked. Thomas kept reading. The director, whoever he was, he figured it out. He knew they'd shut him up, so he sealed this room and hid the evidence, left it here where no one would find it. "Until now," Margaret said quietly. They stood in silence, the weight of discovery settling over them like snow. $280 million. Enough to change their lives. Enough to buy back their children's attention, maybe. Enough to prove they weren't just stubborn old people clinging to a frozen wasteland. Enough to make everyone who'd abandoned them regret it. Margaret looked at Thomas. In the harsh beam of the flashlight, his face was unreadable. "What do we do?" she asked. Before he could answer, they heard something, a sound from deep in the facility. A groan. Then a crack. Thomas's eyes widened. The structure. The blizzard must have compromised it. Another crack, louder this time, ice shifting, metal bending. "We need to leave," Thomas said. "Now." But Margaret was staring at the containers, at the journal in Thomas's hands, at $280 million worth of evidence and greed and corruption. "We can't just leave it," she said. "Margaret, this is proof. Proof of illegal mining, of environmental crimes, of... The ceiling groaned. Dust and ice fell from above. Thomas grabbed her arm. "We document it and we leave. We can come back." Margaret looked at him, then at the room one more time. She pulled out her camera and started taking photographs. Fast, methodical, every container, every angle, the journal pages, everything. 30 seconds. That's all she allowed herself. Then they ran. Back through the stone chamber, through the corridor, up the stairs. Behind them, the sound of ice and metal collapsing grew louder. The facility was coming apart. They burst through the service door into the grey dawn light, stumbling into snow that was falling again, thick and heavy. Behind them, a section of the roof caved in with a sound like thunder. Thomas pulled Margaret away from the building, and they didn't stop until they were 100 yards clear. They turned and watched as Frost Point Research Station, after 41 years of frozen sleep, began to die. But in Margaret's pocket was a camera full of evidence, and in Thomas's backpack was a journal that would change everything. They looked at each other, breathing hard, faces numb with cold. "We need to get home," Thomas said. Margaret nodded, but she knew home would never be the same, because they'd just discovered something that powerful people had tried to bury forever, and now they had to decide what to do with it. The walk back to the cabin took 40 minutes. Neither of them spoke. The wind had picked up again, and the snow fell so thick it erased their footprints almost as fast as they made them. Margaret's legs burned. Her lungs ached from breathing frozen air, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Behind them, somewhere in the white blur, Frost Point Research Station was collapsing into itself. 41 years of secrets being buried again beneath ice and rubble. But not all the secrets. When they finally reached the cabin, Thomas had to help Margaret up the steps. Her hands were shaking too hard to grip the railing. Inside, the wood stove had burned down to embers, and the temperature had dropped to maybe 50 degrees. Thomas got her settled into a chair, then immediately began rebuilding the fire. Margaret sat motionless, her mind still in that stone chamber, still seeing those metal containers, still processing the number. $280 million. "Drink this," Thomas said, pressing a mug of hot tea into her hands. She drank without tasting it. Warmth spread through her chest, but it did nothing for the cold knot of decision forming in her stomach. Thomas sat across from her, the leather journal on the table between them. He'd already removed his outer layers, but his face was still red from windburn, his beard crusted with ice. "We need to talk about this," he said. Margaret nodded. "I know. That facility is going to collapse completely. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but soon. And when it does, all that evidence will be buried forever." "Unless we do something," Margaret said. "Yes." They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire crackled. Margaret thought about her children, about Sarah's letter, about 3 weeks of silence. "We could take it," she said quietly. "The samples. We could go back with proper equipment, extract what we can, sell it. With that kind of money, we could buy our family back," Thomas finished. Margaret flinched. Hearing it said out loud made it sound worse than it was in her head. "That's not what I meant," she said. "Isn't it?" She looked at him. His expression was sad, understanding. "I miss them," she whispered, "and I keep thinking if we just had something to offer, something to prove we're not just wasting our lives up here." "We're not wasting our lives," Thomas said firmly. "And if they can't see that, money won't change it." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." He reached across the table and took her hands. "Margaret, I worked at that facility for 3 years. I saw what happens when people chase money like that. It hollows them out, makes them forget why they started. We're not like them. We could be. That's what scares me." Margaret pulled her hands away and stood, pacing to the window. The snow was already covering their tracks from this morning. By tomorrow, there'd be no sign they'd ever left the cabin. "What if we reported it?" she asked. "Gave the evidence to someone, exposed the whole thing?" Thomas opened the journal and flipped through pages. Most of the people named here are either dead or out of power. This happened 40 years ago. The statute of limitations has probably run out on half of it. But the environmental damage is already done. Those samples were extracted decades ago. Reporting it now won't undo that. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold window glass. "So we just do nothing? Pretend we never found it?" "I didn't say that." She turned. "Then what?" Thomas stood and walked to her. Even at 74, even worn down by years of hard living, he still had a presence that made her feel safe. "We think," he said. "We don't rush. We consider every option, and we remember who we are." Margaret looked into his eyes. "Who are we?" "Scientists, people who spent their whole lives looking for truth, not treasure." She felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm so tired, Thomas. Tired of being abandoned, tired of being told we're wrong for staying, tired of missing our children." "I know," he said softly. "So am I." They held each other in the small cabin while the storm raged outside. And somewhere in the wreckage of Frost Point Research Station, $280 million lay waiting in the dark. But in that moment, holding on to each other after 51 years of love and stubbornness and shared purpose, Margaret and Thomas Parker realized that some discoveries demanded more than just finding them. They demanded deciding who you'd become once you did. For 3 days after they returned from Frost Point, the journal sat on the kitchen table like a loaded gun. Margaret would walk past it, pause, sometimes pick it up, then set it down again. Thomas did the same. They moved around it carefully, as if acknowledging it too directly might force them to make a decision they weren't ready for. The storm had worsened. Snow piled against the cabin walls, cutting them off even further from the outside world. Not that there was much world to be cut off from. The nearest town was 80 miles south. The nearest neighbor was 17 miles east. And their children. Well, they might as well have been on another planet. On the 4th morning, Margaret woke before dawn and found Thomas already at the table, the journal open, reading by lamplight. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Kept thinking about something," he said. "The director's last entry. I've read it a dozen times, and there's something off about it." Margaret poured herself coffee and sat beside him. Her hip ached from the trek to Frost Point. Her hands were still raw from the cold, but her mind was sharp. "Show me," she said. Thomas turned to the final pages. The handwriting was different here, shakier, rushed. "Look at the date. March 15th, 1983. That was the evacuation day. I remember it exactly. They woke us up at 0400 and told us we had 2 hours to pack personal items only." Margaret read the entry aloud. "Final log. Project Midnight Sun terminated by executive order. All personnel evacuated. Samples secured in Vault 3. Coordinates locked. I have done what I can to protect the truth. If you're reading this, you've found what they tried to erase. Use it wisely. The Earth remembers what men forget." "Vault 3, Thomas said. "We were in Vault 3, but look at this." He flipped back several pages. "Earlier entries reference Vault 1 and Vault 2. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "There are more chambers." "And we only saw one." They stared at each other across the table. The implications were staggering. If Vault 3 contained $280 million in mineral samples, what did the others contain? "The facility's collapsing," Margaret said. "You said so yourself." "Parts of it are, but it's a massive structure, and it was built to withstand Arctic conditions. The stone chambers especially, they're not going anywhere. They're carved into bedrock." Margaret stood and walked to the window. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world of pristine white silence. "We have to go back," she said. Thomas nodded. I know. Not for the money. No, he agreed. For the truth. They both knew it was more complicated than that. But it was the story they told themselves as they prepared for the second journey to Frost Point. This time, they packed differently. Thomas brought his old surveying equipment, tools for documenting and measuring. Margaret brought her field kit, the one she hadn't touched in 5 years, still equipped with sample containers, pH testers, and a portable microscope. They weren't going as scavengers. They were going as scientists. The walk to Frost Point took longer in the fresh snow. Their legs sank past their knees with each step. By the time they reached the facility, both of them were breathing hard, their faces numb despite the masks. The damage was worse than Margaret had expected. The entire northwest section of the main building had caved in. Twisted metal jutted from snowdrifts like broken bones. But the eastern entrance, the one Thomas had used, was still intact. They entered carefully, testing each step. The corridor looked the same as before, frozen and abandoned. But as they moved deeper, Margaret noticed something. Her breath wasn't fogging as much. "Thomas," she said, "it's warmer in here." He stopped, testing the air. "You're right, maybe 10 degrees warmer than outside." "How?" "Geothermal. This facility was built on a hot spot. That's why they could operate year-round. And if the geothermal systems are still active, then the deeper levels might still be powered," Margaret finished. They descended the stairs more quickly this time, passing through the blast door into the rough-hewn corridor. The stone chamber was exactly as they'd left it. The containers stood silent. The journal's empty spot on the desk seemed to accuse them. But Thomas didn't stop there. He kept moving, his flashlight sweeping the walls. "What are you looking for?" Margaret asked. "Access points. Vault 3 can't be the only chamber. There has to be a way to reach the others." They circled the room twice before Margaret found it, a section of wall that looked identical to the rest, except for one detail. The stone blocks were slightly smaller, more regular. She pressed against them. Nothing happened. Thomas joined her, running his hands along the seams. "There's a mechanism. Has to be." He pulled out his multi-tool and began probing the gaps between stones. On the 4th attempt, something clicked. A section of wall, roughly 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide, swung inward. Cold air rushed out, not the still cold of the chamber, but moving air, ventilation. Thomas stepped through first, Margaret close behind. They were in a narrow passageway, carved from solid rock. The walls were smooth, almost polished. Every 20 feet, there were metal reinforcement bands, like ribs holding the tunnel intact. "This isn't natural," Margaret said. "This was engineered." "Sophisticated engineering," Thomas added. "This tunnel was meant to last." They walked for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes. The passage sloped downward, taking them deeper into the permafrost. Margaret's ears popped from the pressure change. Then the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one was larger than Vault 3, and it wasn't empty. Along the walls were shelves, metal shelving units that reached from floor to ceiling, packed with containers, folders, boxes, and in the center of the room, a series of display cases. Margaret approached the nearest case. Inside were core samples, perfectly preserved cylinders of permafrost, each labeled with depth markers and coordinates. She'd seen thousands of core samples in her career, but nothing like these. The ice layers showed striations she'd never encountered, mineral deposits in concentrations that shouldn't exist naturally. And embedded in several cores were fragments of something else, something metallic. "Thomas," she called, "you need to see this." He came over, leaning close to the glass. "What am I looking at?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "But it's not natural. Those metallic inclusions, they're too regular, too pure." She moved to the next case. More samples, more impossible geology. Thomas was already at the shelving units, pulling down boxes. Inside were files, thousands of pages of research data, geological surveys, chemical analyses, core logs. Margaret opened one folder at random. The header read, Project Midnight Sun, Phase 2, Deep Extraction Protocols. She read quickly, her scientific mind absorbing the technical language. What she was reading didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. They weren't just mining rare earth elements, she said slowly. They were extracting something else, something they found at depths exceeding 800 meters. What? Thomas asked. Margaret kept reading. They don't say. The documents just refer to it as the substrate. But whatever it is, the concentration values are off the charts. Platinum, iridium, osmium, all the rare metals, but also something unidentified. Thomas pulled out another file. This one contained photographs, grainy, black and white images of core samples being examined under microscopes, and in several photos, researchers in full hazmat suits handling materials in sealed glove boxes. Why would they need that level of containment for mineral samples? He asked. Margaret didn't answer. She was staring at a chemical analysis report. The atomic structure diagrams showed elements she recognized, but arranged in compounds that shouldn't be stable. And at the bottom of the page, handwritten notes. Recommend immediate sequestration. Material properties inconsistent with terrestrial formation. Advise consultation with external specialists. Her hands began to shake. Margaret? Thomas's voice seemed far away. This wasn't a mining operation, she whispered. This was a discovery. Something they found buried in the permafrost that shouldn't exist. Before Thomas could respond, they heard a sound. A low hum, barely audible, coming from deeper in the chamber. They both froze. There's power, Thomas said. Active power. They followed the sound to the back wall where another doorway stood. But this one wasn't hidden. It was obvious, marked with warning signs. Caution, restricted access, authorized personnel only. And beneath the warnings, a small panel with a blinking green light. It's active, Margaret breathed. After 41 years, something down here is still running. Thomas tried the door, locked. But the panel had a keypad, old-fashioned, numbered 0 through 9. We need a code, he said. Margaret thought for a moment. Try the date. March 15th, 1983, 031583. Thomas entered the numbers. The panel beeped. Red light. Coordinates? Margaret suggested. The latitude and longitude of the facility? Thomas pulled out his GPS unit, read off the numbers. Wrong again. They tried 20 different combinations. Nothing worked. Margaret was about to give up when she noticed something. In the director's journal, certain words had been underlined. She'd thought they were just emphasis, but what if they were something else? She pulled out her notebook where she'd copied key passages. The underlined words were scattered through different entries, but when she put them together, they formed a sequence. Midnight, sun, Vault, 3, substrate, truth. Try this, she said, translating the words into numbers based on their position in the alphabet. 13, 19, 22, 20, 19, 20. Thomas entered the code. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the panel turned green. The lock disengaged with a heavy thunk. The door swung open on its own, revealing a stairwell bathed in soft blue light. They descended together, neither speaking. The light came from strips embedded in the walls, some kind of luminescent material that required no power source. The air grew warmer as they went deeper. By the time they reached the bottom, Margaret had unzipped her outer jacket. The chamber they entered was unlike anything above. The walls weren't stone or concrete, but something else entirely. Smooth, almost glass-like, with a faint iridescence that shifted as they moved. And in the center of the room, suspended in a transparent cylinder filled with clear liquid, was a core sample unlike any Margaret had ever seen. It was roughly 3 feet long and 6 inches in diameter. But instead of the layered permafrost she expected, the core appeared to be a single continuous structure. Metallic, but not exactly metal. It seemed to shift and shimmer, as if the material itself was alive. Margaret approached slowly, her scientific training warring with something that felt almost like fear. "What is that?" Thomas whispered. "I don't know," Margaret said, "but I don't think it came from Earth. What they find in the depths of this frozen tomb will change everything they thought they knew about their life's work, reveal why they were truly abandoned, and prove that sometimes the coldest places hold the warmest truths. Stay with us to discover what happens next. If you're captivated by this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Around the cylinder were monitoring stations, all still active. Screens displayed data in real time: temperature, pressure, electromagnetic readings, radiation levels, all within safe parameters, all stable. Margaret moved to the nearest station and began reading the logs. The most recent entry was from 1983, but the monitoring systems had continued collecting data autonomously for the past 41 years. "This material," she said, scrolling through screens, "it's not inert, it's reactive. But slowly, the electromagnetic signature has been increasing by 0.001% annually." "What does that mean?" Thomas asked. "It means whatever this is, it's not dead, it's dormant." Thomas was examining the base of the cylinder. "There are more samples, look." He was right. Set into the floor around the main cylinder were smaller containment units, 12 of them, each holding fragments of the same strange material. And beside each fragment was a data plate with coordinates. "These came from different locations," Margaret said, reading the coordinates, "spread across the entire Arctic basin. They weren't just mining here, they were extracting this material from sites across thousands of square miles." She pulled out her camera and began documenting everything. Thomas did the same with his surveying equipment, taking measurements, recording dimensions. They worked for an hour in focused silence, the way they'd worked together on research sites for 50 years. This was what they knew. This was who they were. Not treasure hunters, not opportunists, but scientists confronting the unknown with careful observation and documentation. Finally, Margaret stepped back and looked at the cylinder again. "We need to report this." "To who?" Thomas asked. "The people who buried it. The government agencies that might be compromised. To the scientific community. This could rewrite everything we know about Arctic geology, maybe even planetary formation. Or it could get confiscated, classified, buried again," Thomas countered, "just like before." Margaret felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. In Vault 3, they'd found evidence of corruption and greed. That was simple, relatively. But this was something else entirely. This was a discovery that could change human understanding of the universe. And they were two elderly researchers, alone in the Arctic, with no institutional support, no political protection, and 3 children who'd stopped calling. "What do we do?" she asked. Thomas looked at the cylinder, then at her. "We finish what the director started. We document everything. We secure the evidence. And we find someone we can trust to help us reveal it properly. And if we can't find anyone, then we go public ourselves." Margaret thought about Sarah's letter, about assisted living facilities and activities, about the way her children saw her and Thomas as relics who'd outlived their purpose. "This could vindicate us," she said quietly. "Prove that staying here, dedicating our lives to this work, it meant something." Thomas took her hand. It always meant something, whether anyone else sees it or not. They gathered their equipment and prepared to leave. Margaret took one last photograph of the cylinder, the strange material inside seeming to pulse with its own inner light. As they climbed back up the stairs, Thomas paused. "Margaret?" "Yes?" "When we report this, our lives will change. We'll be in the spotlight. People will come. The isolation we've protected for so long, it'll be gone." Margaret considered this. The cabin that had been their sanctuary for decades. The silence they'd learned to love. The privacy they'd fought to maintain. "I know," she said, "but some discoveries are bigger than comfort." They made their way back through Vault 2, through the tunnel, through Vault 3. But as they climbed toward the surface, Margaret noticed something that stopped her cold. The emergency lighting was on. Not just a few strips, all of them. The entire corridor was bathed in pale white light. "Thomas," she said, "the lights." He looked around, his expression tightening. "They weren't on when we came in. Which means someone else is here." They moved quickly but quietly, hands on the walls to steady themselves. When they reached the main level, they heard voices. Multiple people speaking in low tones. Thomas pulled Margaret into an alcove and they waited, barely breathing. 3 figures in Arctic gear walked past, carrying equipment cases. They wore patches Margaret didn't recognize. Private security, maybe, or government contractors. "Confirmed the geothermal systems are still active," one said. "Structural integrity is compromised in sections B and C, but the lower levels are intact." "What about the vaults?" another asked. "Vault 3 shows signs of recent entry. Could be structural shift, could be something else. We need to secure it before—" The voices faded as they moved deeper into the facility. Margaret and Thomas looked at each other, understanding passing between them without words. They weren't the only ones who knew about Frost Point, and whoever these people were, they had resources, organization, purpose. They waited 10 minutes, then moved toward the exit as quietly as possible. But as they reached the service door, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a woman, maybe 50, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. She wasn't threatening, but she wasn't friendly either. "Margaret and Thomas Parker," she said. It wasn't a question. Margaret's heart hammered. "Who are you?" "Dr. Ellen Reeves, Department of Energy, Division of Legacy Site Management. We've been monitoring this facility for 23 years. "Monitoring?" Thomas said. "It's been abandoned for 41 years. "No," Ellen corrected. "It's been unsupervised for 41 years. There's a difference." She gestured toward the door. "We should talk, but not here. The structure isn't stable." Outside, 3 black SUVs sat in the snow. More people in Arctic gear were setting up equipment. Margaret saw ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic scanners, sophisticated surveying tools. Ellen led them to one of the vehicles and offered them coffee from a thermos. They accepted, too cold and shocked to refuse. "How did you know we were here?" Margaret asked. "Seismic sensors," Ellen said. "When you entered Vault 3 4 days ago, you triggered monitoring systems we installed in 2000. When you came back today and accessed Vault 2, we had to investigate." "You knew what was down there," Thomas said. "You've known all along." Ellen nodded. Project Midnight Sun was shut down in '83, but the material they discovered, it couldn't just be abandoned. So we've been watching, waiting, making sure it stays contained." "Contained?" Margaret leaned forward. "What is it?" Ellen studied them for a long moment. "You're scientists. Both of you have published extensively on Arctic geology. Thomas, you worked here. Margaret, you're one of the foremost experts on permafrost composition, so I'm going to tell you the truth because you've already seen enough to piece it together anyway." She pulled out a tablet and showed them an image. It was the cylinder from Vault 2, but from different angles with enhanced scanning overlays. In 1977, a research team drilling core samples at a depth of 850 meters found something that shouldn't exist. A substrate of unknown origin embedded in permafrost that dated back approximately 12,000 years. "From the last ice age," Margaret said. "Exactly, but the material itself, it's not terrestrial, or if it is, it predates any known geological formation. The mineral composition includes elements in isotopic ratios we can't explain. And it's reactive." "To what?" Thomas asked. "To magnetic fields, electromagnetic radiation, even to proximity of biological matter. It's as if it's designed to interact with living systems." Margaret felt ice in her stomach. "Designed?" That's the word the original researchers used. And before you ask, No, we don't know by what or whom. We've been studying it for over 40 years, and we're no closer to understanding its origin. Ellen closed the tablet. The reason Frostpoint was shut down wasn't corruption, though there was some of that. It was fear. Fear of what this material might be, what it might do, and what it might mean about our place in the universe. So you buried it, Margaret said, anger rising in her voice. You found something that could revolutionize science, and you buried it. We contained it, Ellen corrected. There's a difference. This material, whatever it is, it's been increasing in activity, slowly but measurably. We don't know what happens if it reaches some critical threshold. We don't know if it's safe to expose to the broader environment. So yes, we kept it secret. We kept it buried. Because sometimes the responsible thing to do is wait until you understand before you act. Thomas set down his coffee. And the 280 million in mineral samples? Ellen smiled faintly. That was the cover story. Easier to shut down a corrupt mining operation than to explain we found something potentially alien buried in the Arctic. Margaret's mind was reeling. Everything they'd discovered, everything they'd documented, it was all bigger and stranger than she'd imagined. Why are you telling us this? She asked. Because you're already involved, and because I need your help. Our help? Ellen nodded. The facility is collapsing. We need to relocate the samples to a more secure location, but we can't just send in an extraction team. The vaults are unstable. We need people who understand the geology, the permafrost dynamics, the structural engineering. Thomas, you know this facility better than anyone alive. Margaret, you understand Arctic soil mechanics. We need you to guide the extraction. And if we refuse? Thomas asked. Then we do it without you, but the risk of catastrophic failure increases significantly. And if those samples are damaged or released into the environment, we have no idea what might happen. Margaret looked at Thomas. She could see the same conflict in his eyes that she felt. This was wrong. The secrecy, the burial of knowledge, the decision to keep this from the world. But Ellen was also right. Without understanding, exposure could be dangerous. We need time to think, Margaret said. Ellen stood. You have 24 hours. After that, we proceed with or without you. She handed Margaret a satellite phone. This has one number programmed, mine. Call when you decide. They drove Margaret and Thomas back to their cabin in one of the SUVs. The driver was silent, professional. When they arrived, Ellen walked them to the door. One more thing, she said. Your children, Sarah, Daniel, Michael, they don't know any of this, and for their safety, it needs to stay that way. Margaret felt cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Are you threatening them? No, Ellen said. I'm protecting them. The fewer people who know about this, the safer everyone is, including you. She walked back to the SUV and drove away, leaving Margaret and Thomas standing in the snow outside their cabin. Inside, they sat at the kitchen table, the satellite phone between them. What do we do? Margaret asked. Thomas opened the director's journal, the one they'd taken from Vault 3. He flipped to the last entry again. The Earth remembers what men forget. Meaning? Meaning maybe we're asking the wrong question. It's not about what we do with this discovery. It's about what this discovery does with us. Margaret understood. They'd spent their lives studying the Earth, learning to read its history in layers of ice and soil, and now the Earth had revealed something that challenged everything they thought they knew. If we help them, she said, we become part of the cover-up. If we don't, Thomas countered, we risk something we can't predict. They sat in silence as the sun set outside, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere beneath the ice, a material of unknown origin pulsed with slow, patient energy. Somewhere in Seattle and Denver and California, their children lived lives that had moved on without them. And somewhere in that small cabin, two elderly scientists faced a choice that would define not just their legacy, but potentially the future of human knowledge. "I need to see it again," Margaret said suddenly. "The cylinder, before I decide." Thomas nodded. "Me too." They looked at the satellite phone. Tomorrow they would call Ellen Reeves. Tomorrow they would give their answer. But tonight they sat together in the home they'd built, surrounded by decades of research and love and stubborn belief that the pursuit of truth mattered more than comfort. And they wondered if they were about to prove themselves right or discover they'd been wrong all along. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, listening to Thomas's steady breathing beside her, watching shadows from the wood stove flicker across the ceiling. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that cylinder, the strange material inside, shifting and shimmering like something alive. She thought about Ellen Reeves's words, potentially alien, 12,000 years old, increasing in activity, and she thought about her children, Sarah, Daniel, Michael, the grandchildren she'd never held. The birthdays celebrated through video calls that grew shorter each year until they stopped altogether. What would they think if they knew? Would they understand why she and Thomas had stayed in Alaska? Would they finally see that some things were worth sacrificing for? Or would they just see two old people who'd stumbled into something they couldn't handle? At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep. She slid out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Thomas, and padded to the kitchen in her thermal socks. The satellite phone sat on the table like an accusation. She made coffee and opened her old field notebooks. Thousands of pages of observations, measurements, hypotheses, tested and refined over decades of work. Her life's research documented in careful handwriting that had grown shakier with age but never less precise. What was it all for? She'd asked herself that question more times than she could count, especially in the last 3 years, especially after Sarah's letters became demands, after Daniel's emails became silence, after Michael stopped pretending to care. She'd told herself it was for science, for knowledge, for the pure pursuit of understanding. But sitting alone in the pre-dawn darkness, Margaret admitted the truth. It had also been for them. To show her children that dedication mattered, that some callings were worth following even when they led to frozen edges of the world, that their mother was more than just a woman who dragged them to Alaska. She was a scientist who'd contributed something meaningful, except they'd never cared. And now she had to decide whether to help bury the discovery of a lifetime or risk exposing something that could be dangerous. Thomas found her at dawn, still at the table, surrounded by notebooks. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Couldn't." He poured his own coffee and sat beside her. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the mug. 74 years old, worn down by decades of hard living, but still the steadiest person she knew. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what Ellen said, about the material being reactive to biological matter." Margaret looked up. And I think she's lying. Or at least not telling us everything." "What makes you say that?" Thomas pulled out his notebook from yesterday's expedition. "The monitoring station's in Vault 2. I photographed the data logs. Look at this." He showed her an image of one screen. "These readings, they're not just tracking electromagnetic activity. They're tracking biological signatures." Margaret leaned closer. He was right. The data included markers for cellular activity, protein synthesis, DNA replication. "They're not just monitoring the material," she said slowly. "They're monitoring how it affects living tissue." "Which means they've tested it on something living." They stared at each other across the table. The implications were staggering. If the Department of Energy had been running biological experiments on extraterrestrial material for 40 years, they'd violated every ethical standard in existence, and they'd done it in secret. "We need to go back," Margaret said. "Not to help them extract the samples, to find out what they're really doing." Thomas nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. They called Ellen at 7. The satellite phone rang twice before she answered. Dr. Reeves. It's Margaret Parker. We've made our decision. And? We'll help, but we need access to all the research data. Everything you have on the material, the experiments, the findings. We can't guide the extraction safely without understanding what we're working with. There was a pause. Margaret could almost hear Ellen weighing the request. That information is classified, Ellen said finally. Then we can't help you, Margaret replied. You came to us because we're experts. Treat us like experts. Give us the data we need to do this properly. Another pause, longer this time. I'll need authorization from my superiors. It could take 24 hours. You said the facility was unstable, that we needed to act quickly. It is, we do. Then get us the data, Margaret said, or find someone else. She ended the call before Ellen could respond. Thomas smiled. That was risky. We're 72 and 74 years old, living alone in the Arctic. Our entire life has been a risk. 3 hours later, a helicopter landed in the clearing behind their cabin. The pilot delivered a sealed case and left without a word. Inside were 2 tablets, both encrypted, both loaded with files. Margaret and Thomas spent the rest of the day reading. What they discovered made Margaret's hands shake with rage. The material wasn't just reactive, it was adaptive. When exposed to living cells, it integrated with them, enhanced them. The early experiments had used bacterial cultures, then plant cells, then small animals, mice, rabbits, eventually primates. The results were consistent. The material bonded with living tissue and improved cellular function. Wounds healed faster, cognitive processing increased, lifespans extended significantly. But there were side effects. The bonded organisms became dependent on proximity to the material. Separation caused cellular degradation, rapid aging, death, and the longer the exposure, the stronger the dependency. They created addiction, Margaret whispered, at a cellular level. Thomas was reading a different file. It gets worse. Look at this. Project Midnight Sun Phase 3, started in 1997. Human trials. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. They tested it on people? Terminal patients, volunteers supposedly, offered them enhanced healing in exchange for participating in classified research. And Thomas showed her the results. Of 37 participants, 29 showed significant improvement. Tumors shrank, organ function restored. For a while. Then the dependency set in. When the subjects were separated from the material, they deteriorated rapidly. Within weeks, they were worse than before. Within months, most were dead. The remaining 8 showed different results. Complete integration, no dependency. Enhanced function that persisted even after separation from the material. But they'd all disappeared from the records in 2003. No explanation, no follow-up, just gone. Margaret set down the tablet. This is monstrous. This is what they've been hiding, Thomas said. Not just the material itself, but what they've done with it. And now they want our help to move it somewhere they can continue experimenting. They sat in silence while the afternoon light faded outside. Margaret thought about the director's last entry. Use it wisely. The earth remembers what men forget. We can't let them have it, she said. Thomas looked at her. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we do what the director couldn't. We expose it. All of it. The discovery, the experiments, the cover-up. They'll bury us, professionally, legally, maybe literally. Margaret stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Arctic stretched endlessly in all directions, white and pure and indifferent to human ambition. We're already buried, she said. We've been buried for 3 years. Our children buried us when they decided we didn't matter anymore. The scientific community buried us when we chose fieldwork over publications and conferences. We're ghosts already, Thomas. What do we have to lose? He came to stand beside her. Our lives, maybe. Our freedom, certainly. We're 72 and 74. How much life do we have left anyway? How much freedom do we have sitting in this cabin waiting for children who won't call? Thomas took her hand. You're sure about this? Margaret thought about Sarah's letter, about assisted living facilities and activities, about being told she'd wasted her life, about dying without her children ever understanding what she'd given everything for. And she thought about those 8 people who'd disappeared from the records, the ones who'd survived integration, the ones who might still be out there somewhere, living with modifications they never asked for. I'm sure, she said. They spent the evening planning. Thomas had contacts from his decades in Arctic operations, researchers who valued truth over politics, journalists who'd broken classified stories before. Margaret knew activists, environmental lawyers, people who'd fought corporate cover-ups and won. Between them, they built a network. It wasn't large, but it was solid. People who couldn't be easily silenced or threatened. At midnight, Margaret composed an email. She attached every file from the tablets, every photograph they'd taken, copies of the director's journal. She wrote a detailed account of everything they'd discovered. Then she looked at the recipient list. 37 names. Scientists, journalists, lawyers, activists, people in 7 countries. Her finger hovered over send. Once we do this, Thomas said quietly, there's no going back. I know. Ellen will come for us. The government, maybe worse. I know. We might never see our children again. Margaret's hand trembled. That was the part that hurt most. The possibility that this would be the final irreversible break. That Sarah and Daniel and Michael would see them on the news, arrested or disappeared, and think only that their stubborn parents had finally gone too far. But she also thought about those 37 human subjects, about the 8 who'd vanished, about the lies buried under layers of classification and fear. She pressed send. The email went out to 37 inboxes around the world. And in that moment, everything changed. They didn't wait for responses. They packed quickly, taking only essentials, documents, hard drives, cold weather gear. Thomas loaded his truck while Margaret made one final walk through the cabin. 50 years of memories lived in these walls. The table where they'd shared thousands of meals. The bed where they'd comforted each other through countless Arctic nights. The bookshelves lined with their research, their lives, their proof that they'd mattered. She touched the rotary phone one last time. It didn't ring. They drove south through the darkness, following old mining roads that most people had forgotten existed. Thomas drove without headlights, navigating by starlight and memory. They needed to get distance between themselves and the cabin before Ellen realized what they'd done. Dawn was breaking when Thomas's phone rang. Not the satellite phone. His regular cell, the one that almost never had service this far north. He pulled over and answered. Margaret could hear the voice on the other end, even without speakerphone. Ellen, angry, controlled, dangerous. What did you do? She said. What we should have done 40 years ago, Thomas replied. You've compromised national security, leaked classified materials. Do you understand what you've done? We understand perfectly. We've exposed crimes against humanity committed in the name of science. Those experiments saved lives and destroyed others, Margaret interrupted, leaning toward the phone. You turned human beings into test subjects. You made them dependent on something you don't understand. And when it went wrong, you erased them. We found the records, Ellen. We know what happened to the 8 who survived. Silence on the other end. Where are they? Margaret demanded. The ones who integrated successfully. Where are they now? That's classified. Everything's classified with you, but not anymore. We've sent everything to people who can't be silenced. Journalists, lawyers, scientists in other countries. By noon, This story will be everywhere." "You've made a terrible mistake," Ellen said, her voice cold. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Then maybe you should have trusted us enough to tell us the truth," Thomas said. He ended the call. They drove for another hour before Thomas spoke again. "You think we did the right thing?" Margaret looked out at the landscape passing by. The sun was rising, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink, beautiful and harsh and utterly indifferent to their choices. "I think we did the only thing we could live with," she said. By 10 in the morning, Thomas's phone started buzzing constantly. Calls from numbers they didn't recognize, messages from news organizations, research institutions, government agencies. Margaret turned it off. They reached a small town called North Junction just before noon. Population 217. One diner, one general store, one motel with 6 rooms. They checked in under false names and paid cash. In the motel room, Thomas turned on the television. The story was already breaking. Leaked documents reveal secret government experiments on extraterrestrial material. Elderly scientists expose decades-long cover-up. Whistleblowers missing, feared in danger. Margaret watched herself on screen. A photograph from 15 years ago, taken at some conference she barely remembered. She looked younger, happier, standing beside Thomas, both of them holding awards for some paper they'd published. "We're missing now, apparently," she said. Thomas flipped through channels. Every news station carried some version of the story. Some called them heroes. Others called them traitors. Most just called them elderly and confused. Margaret's phone rang. She'd left it on, hoping against hope. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. Margaret's hand shook as she answered. "Sarah?" "Mom, what's happening? You're all over the news. They're saying you stole classified documents, that you're on the run. Please tell me it's not true." Margaret closed her eyes, her daughter's voice, worried, scared, but present, actually caring after 3 years of silence. "It's complicated, sweetheart." "Complicated? Mom, they're calling you a national security threat." "We found something, Sarah, something important, and when we tried to do the right thing, we discovered the people in charge had been doing the wrong thing for 40 years. We couldn't stay silent." "So you leaked classified information?" "We exposed human rights violations." Sarah's voice broke. "You could go to prison. You could—" "Mum, you're 72 years old. You can't go to prison." "We knew the risks." "Then why? Why would you do this?" Margaret looked at Thomas. He nodded slightly, giving her permission to say what they'd never said directly. "Because some things matter more than safety," Margaret said. "Because we spent our whole lives pursuing truth, and we couldn't turn away from it just because it became dangerous. And because maybe, just maybe, we wanted you to see that the life we chose, the path we followed, it meant something. It mattered." Sarah was crying. Margaret could hear it through the phone. "Mom, I never thought your life didn't matter. I just wanted you safe. I wanted you close. I wanted my kids to know their grandparents." "You stopped calling." "Because it hurt too much." Sarah's voice rose. "Every time we talked, every time I saw you living in that cabin, so far away, so isolated, it broke my heart. I couldn't watch you fade away out there. So I pushed you to move, and when you wouldn't, I couldn't anymore." Margaret felt tears on her own cheeks. "We never wanted to hurt you." "I know, and I never wanted to abandon you. But I did, and now you're in danger, and I can't help you, and I don't know what to do." "You're talking to me," Margaret said softly. "After 3 years you called. That's enough." They talked for 20 more minutes. Sarah called Daniel and Michael on a 3-way call. For the first time in years, the whole family spoke together. Not about the scandal or the danger, just about life, about the grandchildren, about memories, about love that had gotten buried under distance and stubbornness and fear. When Margaret finally ended the call, she was crying too hard to speak. Thomas held her while she shook, decades of loneliness pouring out. "They still love us," she whispered. They never stopped, Thomas said. They just didn't know how to show it. That evening, there was a knock at the motel door. Margaret and Thomas froze. It could be anyone. Police, federal agents, Ellen's people. Thomas looked through the peephole and his breath caught. He opened the door. Ellen Reeves stood there alone. No security detail, no backup. She looked tired, older than she had 3 days ago. "May I come in?" she asked. Thomas stepped aside. Ellen entered and sat in the chair by the window. She didn't speak for a long moment. "The story's out," she said finally. "My superiors wanted me to bring you in, quietly, before you could do more damage. But then I read the emails you sent. The full files, not the sanitized versions I'd been working with." She looked up at them. "I didn't know about the 8, the ones who disappeared. That wasn't in my briefing. I thought they died like the others, natural progression of the experiments." "They didn't die," Margaret said. "No. I spent the last 6 hours accessing files I wasn't cleared for, pulling records my supervisors didn't want me to see." Ellen pulled out a tablet. "They're alive, all 8 of them, living under new identities in isolated locations monitored constantly. They're prisoners, have been for 22 years. Thomas sat down heavily. "Where?" "Scattered. Alaska, Canada, Norway, Russia. Places where enhanced abilities won't draw attention. Places where they can be contained if necessary." "Enhanced abilities," Margaret repeated. "What does that mean?" Ellen showed them files, medical records, psychological evaluations, capability assessments. The 8 individuals showed cognitive function 30% above baseline, strength and endurance significantly elevated. Healing that was almost instantaneous, and they didn't age. The oldest had been 43 in 2003. He was still 43 now, biologically. "They stopped aging completely?" Thomas asked. "After integration, their cells achieved perfect homeostasis, no degradation, no senescence. As far as we can tell, they're effectively immortal." Margaret felt dizzy. "And you've kept them locked up for 2 decades. "Not me," Ellen said sharply. "I didn't know. But yes, the project, the department. They kept them hidden because they didn't know what else to do with people who couldn't die." "Release them," Margaret said. "It's not that simple. They're dependent on the material, not like the others, not fatally. But they need proximity every few months or they start to degrade. Slowly, reversibly. But it happens. They can't live normal lives." "So you trap them?" Ellen didn't argue. "I came here because what you did, leaking those files, it forced exposure. My superiors can't bury this anymore. There will be investigations, oversight, maybe trials. And I wanted you to know that I'm going to testify. I'm going to tell them everything I've learned, including about the 8. Margaret studied her face. "Why?" "Because you were right. Some things are bigger than security protocols. And because I'm tired of being part of something that treats human beings like property." Ellen stood. "You should know. There's a warrant out for your arrest. Federal charges. I can't protect you from that." "We're not asking you to," Thomas said. "Good. Because what I can do is buy you time. 48 hours before they track you here. Use it wisely. Find lawyers. Prepare your defense. Or run. Your choice." She walked to the door, then paused. "The material, the substrate from Vault 2. We're shutting down the extraction, leaving it in place. After what you exposed, there's no political will to continue the research. Frost Point will be sealed permanently." "What about Vault 1? Margaret asked. "The director's journal mentioned 3 vaults. We only saw 2. Ellen's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe? Or concern. "Vault 1 doesn't exist in any of my files." "It exists," Thomas said. The journal was clear. 3 vaults, 3 different containment sites. Ellen pulled out her phone and made a call. She spoke in low tones for several minutes, then ended the call looking troubled. "My supervisor says there's no Vault 1. Never has been. The facility only ever had 2 containment chambers." Then why would the director write about 3? Margaret asked. They all looked at each other, understanding dawning. There's something else, Thomas said slowly. Something even more classified than what we found. Ellen sat back down. Show me the journal. Everything about Vault 1. Margaret retrieved her notebook where she'd copied relevant passages. Ellen read through them carefully. These coordinates, she said, pointing to a series of numbers written in the margin. They're not for the facility. They're offset, approximately 2 miles northwest. Thomas pulled out a map and calculated. That would put it under the coast, beneath the sea ice. An underwater vault, Margaret said. Isolated, impossible to access without specialized equipment. Ellen looked pale. If this exists, if there's been a third containment site that even my department doesn't know about, then Project Midnight Sun was bigger than anyone thought. And whatever's in Vault 1, it was important enough to hide from everyone. Or dangerous enough, Thomas added. They sat in silence, processing the implications. Somewhere beneath the Arctic Ocean, another chamber might exist. Another collection of materials, experiments, secrets. Margaret thought about the 8 immortal prisoners, about the decades of lies, about the substrate that changed living tissue in ways science couldn't explain. And she wondered what could possibly be so dangerous that it required burial beneath the sea. We need to find it, she said. Ellen shook her head. Even if it exists, even if we could locate it, the facility is collapsing. The permafrost is unstable. Trying to access an underwater vault now would be suicide. Then when? Margaret demanded. After it's buried forever? After whatever's down there is lost? Maybe that's for the best. You don't believe that, Margaret said. If you did, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be planning to testify. You'd still be protecting the cover-up. Ellen stood and walked to the window. Outside, snow was starting to fall again. Soft and quiet and relentless. I spent 23 years believing I was doing the right thing, she said, protecting dangerous knowledge from misuse. But you were right. The real danger was the secrecy, the experiments done without oversight or ethics. The people disappeared because they became inconvenient. She turned back to them. If Vault 1 exists, it deserves to see light. But not like this, not by risking your lives at 72 and 74 years old. It's our discovery, Thomas said. Our choice. And your funeral, probably. Margaret smiled. We're old, Dr. Reeves. We're tired. We've been abandoned by our family and forgotten by our profession. If we die trying to uncover one more truth, that's not a tragedy. That's a fitting end. Your family hasn't abandoned you, Ellen said softly. I've been monitoring communications. Your children have been calling every news station, demanding to know you're safe. Your daughter Sarah has hired a lawyer. Your son Daniel is on a flight to Alaska right now, and Michael started a social media campaign calling for your protection. Margaret felt her eyes burn. They did? Ellen nodded. You exposed something that mattered, and they saw it. The whole world saw it. You're not forgotten anymore, Margaret. You're heroes. Thomas reached for Margaret's hand. She held it tight, feeling the calluses and scars of 50 years together. Then let's finish what we started, she said. Ellen looked at them for a long moment. Then she made a decision. There's a research vessel, the Aurora, currently stationed 30 miles off the coast. It has submersible capability, ground-penetrating sonar, everything we'd need to locate an underwater structure. She pulled out her phone again. I can get us aboard, but we'd need to move fast before my department realizes what we're doing. When? Thomas asked. Now, tonight. There's a helicopter at the airstrip 15 miles north. I can have it here in an hour. Margaret looked at Thomas. This was it, the final choice. They could turn themselves in, face the legal consequences, maybe see their children again, or they could chase one more mystery into the frozen dark. Thomas smiled. The same smile he'd given her 51 years ago when she'd asked him to marry her and move to the most isolated place on Earth. "Let's go find Vault 1, he said. They gathered their equipment quickly. Ellen made calls, arranged transport, pulled strings with people who owed her favors. Within 90 minutes, they were lifting off into the Arctic night. Margaret looked down at the motel, at the small town disappearing beneath them, at the vast white landscape stretching in all directions. Somewhere down there, her children were coming, Sarah and Daniel and Michael, flying toward Alaska to find her, to protect her, to finally understand. And somewhere ahead, beneath ice and water and 40 years of silence, the final secret of Project Midnight Sun waited. She didn't know if they'd survive to see morning, didn't know if Vault 1 even existed, didn't know if exposing one more truth would vindicate their lives or destroy what little time they had left. But she knew this. For the first time in 3 years, she felt alive, purposeful, worthy of the life she'd chosen. Thomas squeezed her hand as the helicopter banked toward the coast, and Margaret Parker, 72 years old, abandoned by her family and forgotten by the world, flew into the darkness chasing one more impossible truth. Because some discoveries don't wait for convenient timing or perfect conditions. Some discoveries demand everything you have, and some people, even at the end of their lives, still have everything to give. The Aurora sat in the freezing ocean like a steel island, illuminated by floodlights that turned the surrounding ice into a field of diamonds. The research vessel was massive, over 300 feet long, designed for prolonged Arctic operations. As the helicopter descended toward the landing pad, Margaret could see crew members securing equipment against the wind. They touched down at 2200 hours. Ellen led them inside immediately, out of the brutal cold. The interior was warm, functional, all metal corridors and watertight doors. A man in his 40s met them, his face weathered by years at sea. "Captain Anders," he said, shaking their hands. "Dr. Reeves called ahead. I understand you're looking for something that officially doesn't exist." "That's one way to put it," Thomas replied. Anders led them to the operations center, a room filled with monitors, sonar equipment, and mapping systems. "We've been surveying this section of coastline for 3 months. Geological research, supposedly. But now I'm wondering if we were looking for something specific all along." Ellen pulled up the coordinates from the director's journal. 2 miles northwest of Frost Point Research Station. Depth approximately 150 meters. We're looking for an artificial structure embedded in the seafloor. Anders input the coordinates and started the sonar scan. The crew worked efficiently, adjusting equipment, filtering signals. Margaret and Thomas stood back, watching decades of technology search for something hidden in 1983. After 20 minutes, one of the operators called out, "Got something. Metal signature, definitely artificial. Shape is regular, geometric, depth 147 meters. Anders brought up the image on the main screen. It was grainy but unmistakable. A rectangular structure, approximately 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, buried in the sea floor. Around it, the sediment showed signs of disturbance, as if something had been deliberately excavated and then covered again. "Vault 1, Margaret whispered. Ellen leaned closer to the screen. "It's bigger than the other vaults, and the construction looks different, heavier, like it was built to contain something more substantial." "Can we reach it?" Thomas asked. Anders nodded. "We have a submersible rated for these depths, but it's a tight fit. 2 people maximum, and the ice conditions make it risky. If the submersible gets trapped, recovery would be nearly impossible." Margaret looked at Thomas. They'd been married for 51 years. In all that time, they'd never needed words to understand each other. "We're going," she said. Anders didn't argue. "Give me 2 hours to prep the submersible and run safety checks. We launch at 0100. Those 2 hours felt both endless and too short. Margaret and Thomas were fitted with thermal suits, given emergency oxygen supplies, taught the basic controls of the submersible. The crew moved around them with practiced efficiency, but Margaret could see the worry in their eyes. Two people in their 70s diving into Arctic waters to investigate a classified site. It was madness. But it was their madness, their choice, their final expedition. At 12:45, Ellen pulled Margaret aside. "Your daughter called again. Sarah, she's in Anchorage. She'll be here by dawn." Margaret's chest tightened. "Did you tell her where we are?" "I told her you're safe, for now. She asked me to convince you to wait for her." "And what did you say?" Ellen smiled sadly. "I told her that some people don't wait for permission to be extraordinary." At 0100 exactly, Margaret and Thomas climbed into the submersible. It was cramped, barely 8 feet in diameter, with a curved acrylic viewport at the front. The controls were simple but precise. Thomas took the pilot seat. Margaret sat beside him, camera and sample containers ready. The launch crew sealed the hatch. The world became muffled, contained. Just Margaret and Thomas, and the hum of machinery. "Ready?" Thomas asked. Margaret reached for his hand. "Always." The crane lifted the submersible and lowered it into the black water. The transition was jarring. One moment, air and light. The next, surrounded by darkness so complete it felt solid. The submersible's external lights clicked on, cutting weak tunnels through the murk. They descended slowly. Thomas kept one eye on the depth gauge, the other on the sonar display. The seafloor appeared on the screen, rising to meet them. At 120 meters, Margaret saw the first signs. Disturbed sediment patterns, scrape marks that looked deliberate. Something had been moved here, excavated, hidden. At 140 meters, the structure came into view. It was massive, far larger than the sonar had suggested. The metal walls were covered in marine growth, but the shape was unmistakable. A perfect rectangle, seamless, built from some kind of alloy that hadn't corroded despite 4 decades underwater. Thomas maneuvered the submersible around the perimeter. There were no obvious entrances, no windows, no external markings, just smooth metal disappearing into sediment. "How do we get in?" Margaret asked. Thomas pointed to the north face. "There, see that outline?" She did. A rectangular seam, barely visible through the growth. A door. He brought the submersible closer, using the mechanical arms to brush away algae and barnacles. Beneath the growth, they found a control panel, corroded but intact, and beside it, something that made Margaret's breath catch. A keyhole, the same size and shape as the one in Vault 3. "The key," she said. "Thomas, do you still have the key from Frostpoint?" He pulled it from his pocket. The brass key he'd carried for 45 years. We'd have to exit the submersible to use it. In 140-meter deep water, in the Arctic Ocean. Yes. They looked at each other. This was beyond risky. This was potentially fatal. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius. Even with thermal suits, they'd have minutes before hypothermia set in. "We didn't come this far to turn back," Margaret said. Thomas nodded and began the decompression sequence. They'd brought emergency diving equipment, military-grade rebreathers designed for polar operations. They suited up inside the cramped submersible, checking each other's equipment 3 times. 5 minutes maximum, Thomas said. In, unlock the door, out. No exploring, no sampling. We verify it exists, we document it, we surface. Agreed. He equalized the pressure and opened the hatch. Arctic water flooded in, so cold it felt like knives. Margaret's thermal suit held, but barely. They swam out together, tethered to the submersible by safety lines. The current was stronger than expected. It pulled at them, trying to drag them into the darkness beyond the lights. Thomas reached the door first and inserted the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Margaret's heart sank. 45 years underwater. No way the mechanism still worked. Then Thomas turned the key with both hands, putting his full strength into it. Something inside the door ground and clicked. The lock disengaged. The door swung open slowly, pulled by its own weight. Beyond it, darkness. But not empty darkness. Their lights reflected off something inside, something metallic and vast. Margaret pulled herself through the opening. Thomas followed. They were inside Vault 1. The space was enormous, at least 4 times the size of Vault 3, and it was filled with equipment. Not storage containers or samples, actual machinery. Massive cylindrical devices arranged in a circle around a central platform. And on that platform, suspended in a transparent chamber filled with liquid, was something that made Margaret forget the cold, forget the danger, forget everything except what she was seeing. A body, human-shaped, but not human. The proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the skull elongated, and it was covered in the same material they'd found in Vault 2, the strange substrate woven through the tissue like veins, pulsing with faint bioluminescence. Thomas grabbed her arm, pointing. Around the central chamber were smaller tanks, 12 of them, each containing organic material, tissue samples, organs, all integrated with the substrate material. Margaret's scientific mind raced. This wasn't just a research site. This was a laboratory, and the being in the central chamber, it wasn't a discovery. It was a specimen, possibly a subject, maybe even a victim. She raised her camera and began photographing everything. Thomas moved to one of the control panels. Even underwater, even corroded, some of the displays were still active. Powered by something that didn't need external electricity, he wiped sediment from one screen and froze. Margaret saw his expression and swam over. The screen showed data, biological readings, vital signs, and at the bottom, a timestamp that was current. Today's date, this hour. "It's alive," Thomas whispered through the rebreather. "After 41 years, it's still alive." Margaret looked at the chamber. The being inside showed no movement, but the substrate running through its tissue pulsed steadily, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. She thought about the 8 human subjects, the ones who'd integrated successfully, the ones who'd stopped aging, and she understood. This was the source. This being, whatever it was where the substrate came from. The material wasn't just found in the permafrost, it was part of something living, something that had been here for 12,000 years, frozen, preserved, waiting. And when Project Midnight Sun found it, they didn't just study it, they harvested it, took its tissue and experimented on humans, created immortality from something they didn't understand. Margaret felt rage and sorrow in equal measure. This creature, if it was a creature, had been imprisoned for 4 decades, kept alive, kept harvested, kept secret. Thomas touched her shoulder. Time to go. Their 5 minutes were almost up. But as they turned to leave, something happened. The lights in the vault changed. The bioluminescence from the substrate grew brighter, and the being in the chamber moved, just slightly. The fingers of one elongated hand twitched. The head turned incrementally toward them, and Margaret swore she saw its eyes open. They scrambled back through the door, pulling themselves toward the submersible. The safety line felt impossibly long. The current fought them. Margaret's limbs were going numb. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. Thomas pulled her into the submersible first, then hauled himself in. He sealed the hatch and initiated emergency ascent. They rose through the dark water faster than was safe, but neither of them cared. At 70 meters, Margaret could breathe again. At 40 meters, feeling started returning to her hands. At 20 meters, Thomas slowed their ascent to avoid decompression sickness. They broke the surface at 01:43. The Aurora's crew had the recovery crane ready. Within minutes, they were being lifted back aboard. Ellen was waiting at the landing pad, her face tight with worry. "Are you insane? You were down there 18 minutes. We thought you died." Margaret couldn't speak yet. Her teeth were chattering too hard. The medical team wrapped them in thermal blankets and rushed them to the infirmary. But before they took her away, Margaret grabbed Ellen's arm. "It's not just material," she managed to say. "It's alive. There's something down there. Someone." Ellen's face went pale. What are you talking about? Vault 1. It's not a storage site. It's a prison. They've been keeping something alive down there for 40 years, harvesting it, using it. The medical team pulled Margaret away, but she saw Ellen's expression. Shock, horror, and something else. Confirmation. As if part of her had always suspected but never wanted to believe. In the infirmary, Margaret and Thomas were treated for mild hypothermia and decompression stress. The ship's doctor wanted to airlift them to a hospital, but they refused. Not yet. Not until they'd finished what they started. At 0300, wrapped in blankets and drinking hot soup, they met with Ellen and Captain Anders in the operations center. Margaret's camera had survived. The images were intact. They displayed them on the main screen. The vault, the machinery, the tanks, and the being in the central chamber. The room fell silent. "What is it?" Anders finally asked. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "But it's not human. The skeletal structure, the proportions, the tissue composition, it's something else." Ellen was scrolling through the data Thomas had photographed from the control panels. These readings, if they're accurate, this organism has been in suspended animation since 1977, kept alive by its own biology, by the substrate material running through its system. "They found it frozen," Thomas said, 12,000 years old, and when they thawed it, instead of studying it, understanding it, protecting it, they used it, harvested its tissue, experimented on humans with material taken from a living being. "That's not research," Anders said. "That's desecration." Ellen set down the tablet. "This changes everything. The experiments, the cover-up, it's not just unethical research. It's evidence of contact, possibly the most significant discovery in human history, and we buried it under the ocean and tried to forget it existed." "What do we do?" Margaret asked. Before anyone could answer, the radio operator called out. "Captain, we have incoming aircraft, helicopter, military markings. They're demanding we stand down and prepare for boarding." Anders looked at Ellen. "Your people?" "Probably," she said. "They know we're here. They know what we've found." "Can they stop us from releasing this information?" Thomas asked. Ellen shook her head. "Not anymore. You already sent the files to 37 contacts. This story is out, but they can arrest us, confiscate the evidence, classify everything under national security." The radio crackled. "Aurora, this is Colonel Marcus Shaw, United States Northern Command. You are operating in restricted waters. Power down and prepare to be boarded." Anders picked up the radio. "Colonel Shaw, this is Captain Anders. We're conducting authorized research in international waters. Your authorization has been revoked. Stand down immediately." Margaret looked at the images on the screen. The being in the chamber, kept prisoner for 4 decades, its tissue harvested, its existence denied, and she made a decision. "Broadcast it," she said. "All of it. Every image, every file, every piece of evidence. Send it to every news organization, every scientific institution, every government in the world." "Margaret," Ellen said carefully, "that's an act of treason. They'll arrest all of us." "Let them," Margaret replied. "But let them do it after the world knows the truth." Thomas nodded. "Do it." Ellen looked at Anders. The captain studied Margaret and Thomas for a long moment. 2 elderly scientists, wrapped in thermal blankets, faces still red from cold exposure, risking everything for a truth no one wanted revealed. He turned to his communications officer. "Open all channels. Prepare to transmit." The helicopter was landing on the pad as the Aurora began broadcasting. Every photograph, every document, every piece of evidence from Vault 1, Vault 2, Vault 3, the experiments, the 8 immortal prisoners, the being kept alive beneath the Arctic Ocean. It went out to every satellite uplink, every internet connection, every frequency the ship could access. By the time the soldiers boarded the Aurora, it was too late. The story was everywhere. Colonel Shaw entered the operations center with 6 armed troops. He looked at the screens, at the data being transmitted, at Margaret and Thomas sitting calmly in their blankets. "You realize what you've done?" he said. "Yes," Margaret replied. "We've told the truth. You've compromised the security of the United States, leaked classified materials, exposed sensitive operations." "We've exposed crimes," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference." Shaw's jaw tightened. "You're both under arrest, federal charges. You'll spend the rest of your lives in prison." "We're 72 and 74, Margaret said. "How much life do we have left anyway?" Before Shaw could respond, the radio operator spoke up. "Colonel, we're receiving incoming transmissions, hundreds of them. News organizations requesting interviews, scientific institutions demanding access to the site, foreign governments filing diplomatic inquiries. Sir, this is going global." Shaw looked at the screens again. Margaret could see him calculating. The story was out. Arresting them now would only make it worse. They'd become martyrs. The government's heavy hand silencing whistleblowers. "This isn't over," he said finally. "No," Ellen agreed, stepping forward. "It's just beginning. And for the record, Colonel, I'll be testifying about everything I know, every experiment, every cover-up, every violation. Because these two people had more courage in one night than our entire department showed in 40 years. Shaw stared at her. "You're finished, Reeves." "Probably," she said. "But at least I'll be able to sleep." The soldiers escorted Margaret, Thomas, and Ellen to the helicopter. As they lifted off, Margaret looked back at the Aurora. Captain Anders and his crew were still broadcasting, still sending evidence into the world. The sun was rising. The Arctic sky turned shades of orange and gold, painting the ice in colors that made it look like another planet, beautiful and harsh, and finally revealing its secrets. They landed at a military airstrip 30 miles inland. Instead of a prison, they were taken to a processing facility. Lawyers were already waiting. Sarah's lawyer demanding their immediate release. Civil rights organizations threatening lawsuits, international observers insisting on oversight, and standing in the waiting area, having flown through the night, were Sarah, Daniel, and Michael. Margaret saw them through the glass partition, and her legs went weak. Thomas caught her. Together, they walked through the doors into a room where their children waited. Sarah reached them first. She was crying before she even spoke. "Mom, Dad, you're okay. You're alive." She wrapped her arms around Margaret, and Margaret felt something break open in her chest. All the loneliness, all the abandonment, all the years of silence. It poured out in tears she couldn't control. Daniel joined the embrace. Then Michael. The whole family holding each other while lawyers and officials and soldiers watched. "You're insane," Sarah said through her tears. "Diving into the Arctic Ocean at your age, exposing government conspiracies. You're completely insane." "I know," Margaret whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we worried you." "Don't apologize," Daniel said. His voice was thick with emotion. "You were right about everything. About staying in Alaska, about your research mattering, about all of it. We were wrong to push you to leave. We just didn't understand." Michael pulled back, wiping his eyes. "The whole world is talking about what you did. You're heroes. Actual heroes. And I spent 3 years being ashamed that my parents lived in the Arctic. I'm the one who should apologize." They sat together in that sterile waiting room while the world exploded outside. News crews gathered at the gates. Scientists demanded access to Vault 1. Governments argued about jurisdiction. And slowly, inevitably, the truth forced its way into light. The being in Vault 1 was transferred to an international facility under United Nations oversight. The 8 immortal subjects were released from containment and given legal protection. Investigations were launched into Project Midnight Sun and everyone involved. And the charges against Margaret and Thomas were quietly dropped. No government wanted to prosecute 2 elderly whistleblowers who'd exposed human rights violations and possibly the most significant discovery in human history. They returned to their cabin 3 weeks later. The place looked exactly the same. Snow on the roof, smoke curling from the chimney, the generator humming its familiar song. But everything had changed. Sarah came with them. She'd taken a leave of absence from work to spend time with her parents, to finally understand the life they'd built. Daniel visited every weekend, bringing his wife and kids. Michael called daily, planning his move to Anchorage to be closer. The scientific community descended on Alaska. Researchers from every discipline, all wanting to study the substrate, understand its properties, learn from the being that had been kept secret for so long. Margaret and Thomas became consultants, advisors, the keepers of knowledge everyone suddenly valued. But the best part, the part that mattered most, was the quiet evenings. Margaret and Thomas at their kitchen table, Sarah making dinner, grandchildren playing on the floor. The cabin filled with life and laughter and family. One evening, 6 months after the discovery, Margaret sat on the porch watching the northern lights dance across the sky. Thomas came out and handed her coffee. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Everything we went through?" Margaret thought about the cold water, the arrests, the years of isolation, the children they'd lost for so long, and she thought about the truth they'd uncovered, the being set free, the experiments ended, the family restored. "No," she said, "not for a second." Thomas sat beside her. "Me neither." They watched the aurora borealis in comfortable silence. 51 years together, a lifetime of choosing truth over comfort, and finally, recognition that it had all been worth it. Inside, Sarah called them for dinner. Margaret could hear her grandchildren laughing, could smell food cooking, could feel warmth and love and purpose radiating from the cabin they'd refused to leave. She stood and offered Thomas her hand. He took it, and together they walked inside. Not because they were old and needed support, but because after everything, they still chose to face the world together. The world eventually learned the full truth about Vault 1. The being, identified only as Subject 0, showed signs of advanced consciousness. Communication attempts were ongoing. Its tissue, the substrate that had created 8 immortal humans, was studied under the strictest ethical guidelines. No more experiments, no more harvesting, just careful observation and respectful interaction. Margaret and Thomas published their findings, not in classified reports, but in open journals accessible to everyone. The cabin became a pilgrimage site for scientists, students, anyone who believed truth mattered more than convenience. They gave lectures together, traveling when their health allowed. They told the story of 2 elderly researchers who'd bought a cabin for isolation and ended up changing human history. They talked about integrity, about refusing to look away from hard truths, about choosing principle over safety. And they talked about family, about Sarah and Daniel and Michael, who'd thought their parents were wasting their lives, but learned that some lives look small from a distance and infinite up close. On Margaret's 75th birthday, the international scientific community awarded her and Thomas the Bauer Prize, the highest honor in Arctic research. They accepted it together, holding hands on stage, 2 people who'd spent 54 years proving that dedication, integrity, and love could survive anything, even abandonment, even isolation, even the coldest places on Earth. In her acceptance speech, Margaret said something that would be quoted for generations. "We didn't set out to be heroes, we set out to be honest, and sometimes, in a world that values comfort over truth, honesty is the bravest thing you can choose." 3 years after the discovery, Margaret and Thomas still lived in their cabin, still woke before dawn, still watched the Arctic sky paint itself in impossible colors. But now, when the phone rang, they answered it eagerly. When family visited, they came often and stayed long. The cabin that had been a refuge from a world that didn't understand became a home that welcomed everyone willing to learn. And Vault 1, The underwater chamber that had held secrets for 4 decades became a symbol. Proof that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, eventually surface. Proof that 2 people, even at 72 and 74, could change the world if they refused to stop caring. Subject Zero remained in international custody, treated with dignity and respect. Scientists worked tirelessly to understand its origins, its biology, its consciousness, and every report acknowledged Margaret and Thomas Parker, the researchers who'd risked everything to free it. The 8 immortal subjects, the ones who'd been imprisoned for integration, became advocates. They spoke publicly about medical ethics, human rights, the dangers of unregulated research. They were living proof that scientific progress without moral foundation led only to suffering. And somewhere in that ecosystem of change and revelation and healing, Margaret and Thomas continued their work, documenting, observing, pursuing truth with the same quiet determination that had defined their entire lives. They weren't young anymore. Their hands shook more than they used to. Their steps were slower, but their minds remained sharp, their purpose clear, their love for each other and for truth undiminished. One evening, Thomas found Margaret in her office reviewing data from the latest Vault 1 surveys. She looked tired but content. "Still working?" he asked. "Always," she smiled. "There's so much we still don't understand." "We have time." She looked at him. "Do we? We're 75 and 77 now. How much time do we really have?" Thomas sat beside her and took her hand, the same hand he'd held for 54 years. "Enough," he said. "We have enough." And he was right, because time isn't measured in years or decades, it's measured in moments of meaning, and Margaret and Thomas had filled their lives with moments that mattered. They'd chosen truth when lies were easier. They'd chosen integrity when corruption was profitable. They'd chosen family even when family chose distance. And they'd chosen each other every day, through every challenge, every discovery, every impossible choice. Anyone can choose truth if they're willing to pay the price. Anyone can stand for integrity if they're brave enough to face consequences. And anyone can change the world if they remember that the most powerful force isn't money or weapons or authority. It's people who refuse to look away from what matters. As the midnight sun hung low on the horizon, painting the Arctic in endless twilight, Margaret Parker closed her laptop and stood. Thomas was already at the door, offering his hand. Together, they walked outside to watch another day refuse to end in the land that never quite let go of light. Their children were coming tomorrow, their grandchildren the day after. The cabin would be full of life and noise and love. But tonight, it was just them. 2 scientists who'd stumbled into something impossible and refused to bury it. 2 people who'd been abandoned and chose to keep loving anyway. 2 souls who'd built a life in the coldest place on Earth and proved that warmth comes not from climate, but from purpose. The research station where they'd found Vault 3 had finally collapsed completely, buried under ice and time. But the truth it had held would never be buried again. The being in Vault 1 was healing, communicating, teaching humanity that we're not alone and never were. And the Parkers, Margaret and Thomas, lived to see it all. Not as victims, not as whistleblowers, but as exactly what they'd always been, scientists who believed the universe deserved honest witnesses, and family members who understood that love, real love, survives any distance if you're willing to do the work of closing it. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some truths are worth any sacrifice.